Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. This time we're going to exploring something, a topic that's probably on a lot of people's minds these days, elder care.
Absolutely.
And you hear it everywhere, but it's kind of one of those things where you're like, okay, what does that actually mean?
Yeah.
Um, so we're going to dive into a bunch of sources that we have on this to try to figure out what elder care is, how to make those tough decisions between home care and facilities,
Hmm.
what are the costs involved, how can you actually pay for it, and of course the planning aspect of it all.
Right.
And it's something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, just with my own family, even seeing those senior moments starting to pop up more frequently.
Sure.
It's like, oh, okay, this is something that's not going away, and I need to actually start thinking about it.
Exactly. And it's one of those things that people kind of put off
Yeah,
because it's emotionally charged and it's
yeah,
a lot to think about and it can feel very overwhelming.
for sure.
So we're here to break it down and help everyone kind of make sense of it all.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's get right into it.
Ugh.
I keep seeing this term elder care everywhere, but I'm like, okay, what does that actually mean in real life?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And one of the sources I saw was talking about something called ADL's activities of daily living.
Yes.
And they were saying like, bathing, dressing, eating, using the restroom.
Huh?
Is that kind of like the trigger point where when someone starts needing help with those basic things, is that when we start thinking, okay, maybe we need to consider elder care?
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to look at it. You think about ADLs as kind of like the building blocks of being able to be independent.
Right?
And when those start to crumble, that's generally when you see that there's a need there. And it's not just about the physical needs either. It's
Yeah.
about mental well-being, emotional well-being, their social well-being.
Right.
One of the sources really highlighted this, and I thought this was interesting. It was talking about how for many of the people who are in homes, their best friends are the nonces,
Oh, wow.
and how there's no real engagement of the human spirit. Yeah.
And so that's a very important thing to consider.
Yeah, that makes me think about finding the right fit in terms of like whether it's home care or facility.
Yeah.
Because obviously, so many seniors I'm sure would prefer to just stay in their homes.
Right.
And actually, one of the sources cited a statistic that said 2/3 of U.S. adults, and then even more so, over 3/4 of those over 50 prefer to stay at home as they age.
Right.
So that's got to be a huge factor in those decisions.
Absolutely. There's this very strong emotional connection to home.
Yeah.
But you also have to consider, you know, safety and level of care are paramount.
Right.
One of the sources was talking about how homes need to be adapted for safety,
Mm-hmm.
like, for instance, fall prevention,
Yeah.
having things to prevent falls. And they were saying, like, with dementia, you have to consider so many things.
Oh, wow.
And it said that this could be from small things to very extensive modifications.
Yeah, I can imagine that can get really complicated.
It can, very much so.
Oh.
So what about when staying at home just isn't an option? What other kinds of housing situations are out there?
Right. Well, one of the sources gave a breakdown of the types of facilities that are available.
Uh-huh.
And the first one was adult family care homes.
Okay.
And then we have assisted living.
Okay.
And it said these often have what are called memory care units,
Right.
which are specially designed for those who need a little extra help.
Yeah.
And then there are skilled nursing facilities,
Mm-hmm.
which can range from long-term care to rehab. And then there's CCRCs.
CCRCs, right.
Mm-hmm.
Continuing care retirement communities.
Mm.
I always think of like those cruise ship senior stereotypes, but I'm sure it's not actually like that.
Not quite, but that's a good visual.
Yeah.
What they do, though, is they offer what's called a continuum of care. And one of the sources explained it as basically you can age in place for the rest of your life.
Oh, wow.
So, you might start out in independent living
Right.
and you're in your apartment and you can enjoy all the social activities and all the amenities. And then as your needs change, you can transition to assisted living within that same community.
Oh, that's nice.
Or even into skilled nursing care as those needs require, without having to uproot and move to a whole new facility.
Right. And that probably makes a huge difference for families, too.
Absolutely.
Okay. But let's face it, we have to talk about the cost.
We do.
Because the numbers I was seeing in these sources, they're a little scary.
Yeah.
And I'm sure a lot of people are just like, how am I going to pay for this?
Yes.
Assisted living on average, like $4,300 a month. That's over $51,000 a year.
Yeah.
And then nursing homes, the average in Wisconsin was almost $9,600 a month.
Wow.
And in some areas, it's hitting $12,000 a month.
That's more than a mortgage for a lot of people.
Exactly. Like, how is this even possible?
And one of the sources actually posed the question, will we go broke?
Yeah.
Because it is something that a lot of people are thinking about.
Right. And I think a lot of people probably just assume, oh, Medicare will cover it.
Right.
But actually, several of these sources said Medicare usually does not cover long-term care in those kinds of settings.
It doesn't, it's designed more for those acute medical needs, not that long-term care.
Yeah, so if Medicare is not going to cover it, what are people supposed to do?
Right, that's the big question.
Yeah.
And the sources offered a bunch of different ideas,
Okay.
but it really depends on your own individual circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
Long-term care insurance was brought up a lot,
Okay.
but they all said you need to get it before you need it.
So you can't wait till the last minute.
You can't, the older you get, the more expensive it gets.
Oh, right.
And then the harder it is to qualify for it.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like that ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Okay, so planning ahead is key. What else did they suggest?
Well, a lot of them said life insurance.
Oh, interesting.
So depending on the policy you have,
Okay.
you might be able to borrow against the cash value or even convert it to a long-term care plan.
Got it. So that's something to look into.
Yes. And then, of course, there are veterans benefits
Right.
that some veterans and their spouses may qualify for.
So that's worth exploring too.
It is, if they have that military background, definitely.
And then I also saw something about reverse mortgages,
Yeah.
which is basically allowing homeowners to tap into their home equity
Right.
to pay for care. But I imagine there are some catches with that.
There are. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Okay.
You need to very carefully look at the pros and cons.
Yeah, makes sense. I also saw Medicaid mentioned as well.
Mm-hmm. Medicaid is often the safety net for people,
Okay.
especially those with lower income.
Right.
But the criteria to qualify for Medicaid really depends on what state you're in.
So it's not like a federal standard?
It's not.
Okay, so then how are you supposed to even figure out what applies to you?
Well, a lot of the sources said that there are organizations
Okay.
like the National Association for Area Agencies on Aging,
Okay.
and they can help connect you with local resources to figure out what's available.
So that's a good starting point.
It is. And then there are also long-term care ombudsmen
Okay.
who can advocate for residents' rights and help resolve complaints.
So those are good people to know about too.
They are?
And then there was one more thing that you mentioned earlier that I wanted to circle back to about the family caregiver agreements.
Yes.
And this is actually allowing family members to be paid
Okay.
for providing caregiving services.
Is that common?
It is gaining more traction
Okay.
because people are starting to understand that family caregivers play such an important role.
Yeah.
And it can be a win-win
Okay.
because it allows the loved one to receive quality care from somebody that they trust,
Right.
but it also allows the caregiver to receive financial support for their efforts.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And it can be structured in a way that protects their assets, particularly with this thing called the 5-year Medicaid look-back rule.
Which I'm sure is a whole other can of worms.
Okay, so speaking of kind of tricky rules and regulations and things like that, I think we need to start talking about the planning aspect of all of this.
We do.
Because, I know it's not the most exciting topic,
Sure.
but it seems like from everything we've talked about so far,
Right.
you really have to get a head start on this.
You do. And one of the sources put it very simply, the earlier you plan, the better.
Makes sense.
Because if you wait for a crisis to hit,
Right.
you're in trouble. It's like trying to build a boat when you're already drowning.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
So you have to prepare in advance.
Right. And so part of that planning is not just the logistics of care,
Right.
but also the legal side of things, right?
Exactly.
One of the sources mentioned, these essential documents,
Mm-hmm.
wills, durable power of attorney for finances, advanced healthcare directives,
Yes.
even living trusts,
Yeah.
all things that nobody really wants to talk about,
Right.
but it seems like you really have to.
You have to. And one of the sources pointed out how these conversations can be really tough because family dynamics come into play.
Oh, yeah.
Like you'll have siblings that favor one parent over the other, or they haven't really had these open discussions
Yeah.
about care preferences. And so you need to be having these conversations early on to make sure everybody is on the same page.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it's probably better to do it before things get really stressful.
Absolutely.
And then on top of that, you have to remember that, life changes.
It does.
So it's not just about doing these things once,
right.
but it's about regularly reviewing and updating those
Right.
legal and financial documents.
Absolutely. As your situation changes, so should those plans. It's really important to remember, that everyone's different and their care needs to be tailored to their specific situation.
Right. It's not like there's a one-size-fits-all approach.
Exactly.
And speaking of tailoring care, it's interesting because one of the sources was saying that if someone needs help with just a couple of those ADLs we talked about earlier,
Mm-hmm.
like just say bathing and dressing,
Yeah.
that's often kind of a tipping point where they
Right.
start needing more extensive long-term care.
Right.
And that's when those costs can really start to become an issue.
They can, and one of the sources actually said the average person who needs that level of care needs it for over 4 years.
Wow.
And for women, it's even longer. 4 out of 10 women will need that level of care for 4 years or more.
That's a long time.
It is a long time.
That really puts it into perspective.
Yeah.
And, speaking of the financial side of things, I was really surprised to learn that you can actually get paid to care for your own parents in certain situations.
You can.
It's called a family caregiver agreement, right?
Yes, that's right.
And that seems like a really interesting option for families who maybe want to keep their loved one at home,
Mm-hmm.
but need a little bit of financial support to make it work.
Absolutely. And it's a win-win because your loved one gets that quality care from someone they know and trust.
Right.
And you, as the caregiver, get some financial support for your efforts. And plus, it can be structured in a way that protects their assets, which is really important, particularly because of those tricky Medicaid rules.
Yeah, speaking of Medicaid, that 5-year look-back rule always seems to trip people up.
It does. It's very confusing.
It's like this big financial puzzle.
Yeah.
But it sounds like, having a solid plan in place, maybe even working with an elder law attorney, is kind of key to navigating that whole process.
It is. And an elder law attorney can really be a lifesaver
Oh.
when it comes to understanding Medicaid
Mm-hmm.
and, exploring options like asset protection strategies.
Okay.
They can help you make those informed decisions that are in everyone's best interest.
Right. So it's worth looking into.
It is.
And one thing that came up in a few of the sources was this idea of having those tough conversations with your loved one
Yeah.
about their care preferences
Mm-hmm.
before a crisis hits.
Absolutely.
Because waiting until there's like a medical emergency or something,
Right.
it seems like it would just make everything so much more stressful.
It would be very difficult.
So, one source was even suggesting using holidays as an opportunity
Okay.
because families are often together then,
Right.
to kind of observe, are there any changes in your loved one's behavior
Yeah.
or abilities?
That's a good idea.
Not to like bombard them with questions then,
Yeah.
but just to be more attuned to like what's going on.
To be more aware.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very insightful suggestion.
And then when it is time to have those conversations,
Yeah.
it's all about approaching it with sensitivity and respect.
Absolutely.
And one source actually had a really interesting tip about this. It said to try framing the conversation in terms of your anxieties
Okay.
rather than directly confronting your loved one.
Oh.
So, for example, instead of saying, "Mom, you're having trouble driving,"
Mm-hmm.
you could say, "Mom, I'm worried about your safety when you're driving."
Right.
So it kind of shifts the focus a little bit
It does.
from like judgment to concern,
Right.
and it makes it a little bit more collaborative.
It does. It's a much better approach.
Yeah. And, it's just about letting them know that you're coming from a place of love and support.
Absolutely.
And then, another thing that we kind of touched on before, but I think it's really important to reiterate is making sure that all those legal documents,
Yeah.
like powers of attorney,
Mm-hmm.
are up to date.
Yes.
Because one source was even saying that if you have documents that were drawn up before 2010,
Okay.
they might actually need to be revised.
That makes sense because laws change.
Exactly.
And so you want to make sure that they reflect the current standards.
You're right. So it's worth checking in with an attorney and just making sure everything's still valid.
Absolutely.
And then speaking of, kind of sensitive topics, one of the sources went into this whole thing about sibling dynamics
Oh, yeah.
and how that can sometimes create tension in elder care situations.
It can.
They were talking about how sometimes you have children who might favor one parent over the other,
Yeah.
or they might have different opinions about what kind of care is best.
Yeah.
And all of that can lead to conflict.
And that's very common, sadly.
It's sad, but it's true.
It is.
And so one of the sources had some really good advice about this.
Okay.
They said, try to put aside any personal feelings you might have
Right.
and just focus on what is best for both parents.
Absolutely easier said than done, though, right?
Oh, for sure.
When emotions are involved,
Yeah.
it's tough.
Yeah. But I think it's a good reminder to try to prioritize their needs and well-being
Yes.
above everything else.
Above everything else.
And, and if it gets to be too much, remember, it's okay to ask for help,
Absolutely.
whether that's from an elder law attorney or
Yep.
a geriatric care manager
Right.
or even a therapist.
Yes.
Sometimes having that neutral third party can be really helpful.
It can.
in facilitating those conversations and finding solutions that work for everyone.
Right, because they can kind of see things from a different perspective.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes you just need that outside perspective.
You do.
One thing that really stood out to me in these sources was this idea of focusing on the person's remaining life,
Yeah,
not just their end of life,
that's a good point.
right? And making sure that their days are filled with, joy and purpose and connection,
Right.
not just medical appointments and routines.
Exactly. And one of the sources put it so beautifully.
Right.
They said elder care should be about engaging the human spirit.
I love that.
I do too.
Yeah.
And it really emphasizes that even as we age, we still crave connection
Yeah.
and meaning and a sense of belonging.
Absolutely.
So it's about more than just, taking care of their physical needs. It's
Well-
about nurturing that sense of self and purpose.
It's about making them feel seen and valued,
Yes.
not just cared for.
Exactly. And that can take a lot of different forms, like
Yeah.
exploring different care models,
Right.
maybe adult daycare centers, or even hiring a companion for in-home care. It's finding what works for their personality and their interests.
And I'm sure that can change over time too,
It can.
right? So it's about being adaptable.
Absolutely.
And even if someone is in a facility,
Yeah,
families can still play such a vital role
they can.
in fostering those connections, right through regular visits and phone calls, sharing stories.
Absolutely.
Even small gestures can go a long way
They can.
in making their day a little bit brighter.
Right. And reminding them that they're loved.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is so important.
And speaking of little things that can make a big difference,
Yeah.
I saw this really interesting tip in one of the sources
Okay.
about incorporating balance exercises
Okay.
into a senior's daily routine.
All right.
And they had this technique called habit stacking.
Okay. I've never heard of that.
Yeah, so basically you pair a new habit,
Mm-hmm.
like the balance exercises,
Okay.
with an existing habit, like their morning cup of coffee or tea,
Oh, that's a good idea.
right? So it makes it more likely that they'll actually do it.
Right, because it becomes part of their routine.
Yeah, exactly.
Like those reminders on your phone to take your medication.
Right,
After a while, it becomes second nature. And with
Yeah.
balance, it's all about consistency.
right.
Even a few minutes a day can really make a difference.
And they were giving examples of really simple exercises,
Mm.
like standing on one leg for a few seconds,
Okay.
or just shifting your weight from side to side.
So simple.
Yeah, but apparently those can really help
They can.
with balance and mobility.
Absolutely.
Speaking of prevention,
Mm-hmm.
one of the sources was really emphasizing the importance of medication management in elder care.
Right.
Especially making sure that medications are reviewed regularly with a doctor,
Yes.
particularly if someone's taking multiple prescriptions,
Mm-hmm.
because it's so easy for things to get overlooked.
It is.
And, those interactions between medications can be really serious.
Absolutely. It's like juggling a bunch of balls in the air. Eventually one's going to drop,
Right.
and that can have consequences.
And one of the sources was even suggesting, talking to the doctor, about whether their lifestyle changes
Oh, okay.
that could potentially reduce the need for some medications.
Okay.
So things like losing weight,
Mm-hmm.
exercising more,
Yeah.
or making dietary changes.
Right. Getting to the root of the problem. Yeah,
Exactly.
not just treating the symptoms.
But those can have a big impact, not just on medication needs,
Right.
but just on overall health and well-being.
It's a much more holistic
Yeah.
approach to their care.
And, speaking of taking kind of a proactive approach,
Yeah.
one of the sources was talking about creating a detailed care log
Okay.
when you're caring for a loved one,
Right.
especially if you're hoping to be paid as a family caregiver.
Right.
And they were saying to include things like activities of daily living,
Mm-hmm.
so feeding, toileting, mobility assistance, transportation, all of those things that you might not think about,
Yeah.
but are really essential for their well-being.
And those logs can be so valuable because they provide documentation
Okay.
of the level of care you're giving,
Right.
which can be important if you're applying for government programs or if you're trying to get reimbursed from insurance companies.
So it's like a paper trail that shows what you've been doing.
Exactly.
And it's proof of the value of that care.
Absolutely.
And it can also be really helpful for communication purposes.
Right.
Both with other family members
Mm-hmm.
and with healthcare professionals
Yeah.
who are involved in
Absolutely.
your loved one's care.
Because it makes sure that everybody is on the same page
Exactly.
and aware of what's going on.
And, speaking of communication,
Yeah.
one thing that I think is really important is that if your loved one is in a facility, that you maintain open communication
Absolutely.
with the staff
Yeah.
and the nurses and the administration,
It's so important.
because it helps ensure that your loved one is getting the best possible care.
Exactly.
And, don't be afraid to ask questions
Right.
or voice concerns or even make suggestions.
Absolutely. You're part of the care team.
Yeah, exactly. It's about working together
It is.
to create the best possible experience for your loved one.
It is. One interesting idea I came across was the possibility of a power of attorney actually working with other professionals,
Oh, okay.
like CPAs or financial planners or investment advisors, to help manage the individual's finances.
Right.
So it's not just the power of attorney's responsibilities.
It's not they can have help.
Right.
And I think that's really important because they might not have expertise in all of those areas.
Right. It's like having a whole financial dream team
Yeah, a whole team to support them
to support them.
and to protect the individual's financial well-being.
Exactly. And, speaking of financial stuff,
Yeah.
one of the sources had this really interesting reminder.
They said even if you think your loved one has long-term care insurance, it's a good idea to double-check the paperwork.
Yeah.
Because people forget.
They do.
They forget they have these policies.
Right, especially if it was purchased a long time ago.
Right, exactly.
It's like hidden treasure.
It is.
You have to go dig it up.
Yeah, because that could really make a difference in affording quality care,
It could.
And speaking of potential resources, don't forget about veterans and their spouses.
Right.
One of the sources mentioned that they might be eligible for financial assistance with long-term care.
Yes, they might.
So it's definitely something worth looking into.
Absolutely a benefit they earn through their service.
Exactly.
And it's important to make sure that they take advantage of all the resources that are available to them.
Absolutely. One thing that I think often gets overlooked
Yeah.
when planning for long-term care is the potential impact on the healthy spouse.
Yes.
Because, if you don't plan carefully, the cost of caring for one spouse
Yeah.
can really deplete the couple's assets
It can.
and leave the healthy spouse in a vulnerable position.
Yeah, that's a really important point, and it often gets forgotten.
It does.
And that's where having a good plan in place,
Right.
possibly with an elder law attorney, can be so helpful.
Yeah.
Because they can look at all the options for protecting the healthy spouse's assets,
Right.
making sure that they're taken care of financially.
And it really emphasizes that it's not just about the individual.
It's not who needs care.
It's about the whole family.
It's about the family.
It is.
Speaking of kind of the bigger picture, one of the sources really emphasized the importance of having those tough conversations about end-of-life care
Yeah.
before a crisis happens.
Yes.
Because, nobody wants to think about that.
Right.
But it's so crucial
It is.
to make sure that your loved one's wishes are respected.
Absolutely. And that they have a voice
Right.
in their own care.
And that their values and preferences are honored.
Yeah, one of the sources suggested that it can be helpful to actually involve a doctor
Oh, okay.
in those conversations
Okay.
because they can provide that medical context and help guide the discussion in a sensitive and informative way.
Right. They can help to answer those really tough questions.
Exactly.
And it's not just about, the medical decisions. It's
Uh-huh.
about, their values, their priorities, maybe their spiritual beliefs.
Right.
It's about a much more holistic conversation.
Right. It's about more than just checking boxes.
It is.
It's about understanding what's important to them
Exactly.
and making sure that their plan aligns with their overall vision for, their final chapter.
Yeah. And remember, it's an ongoing process.
It is.
It's not a one-time conversation.
Right. Because as things change, their wishes might change as well.
Exactly.
So it's about staying connected, staying informed, staying adaptable.
Couldn't agree more.
Okay, so, wow, we have covered a lot of ground here today. From defining elder care to exploring different care options.
Yeah.
And then all the financial stuff.
Absolutely.
And then, getting into those sensitive emotional and legal considerations.
Yes.
It's a lot to process.
It is.
And I think it's important to remember, you don't have to figure it all out on your own.
There are resources available to help.
Right.
There are elder law attorneys, geriatric care managers, support groups, online communities.
Right. And I think connecting with other families who have been through this
Absolutely.
can be so helpful.
It can.
Because, they can share their experiences and their tips and just knowing that you're not alone.
Exactly. Sometimes that's all you need.
Yeah.
Is to know you're not alone.
And I think, the big takeaway from all of these sources is that planning is crucial.
Absolutely.
The more prepared you are,
Yeah.
the better equipped you'll be to navigate all the challenges
Right.
of elder care and make those informed decisions.
And make sure that your loved ones' wishes
Yeah.
are honored and that their well-being is taken care of.
And remember, planning is an act of love.
It is.
It's a way to show your loved ones that you care and to support them.
And to make things a little bit easier
Yeah.
for everybody involved.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Beautifully said.
So I think that's a perfect place to stop for today.
It is.
But we'll pick up the conversation in our next installment,
We will.
where we'll explore even more strategies for navigating the world of elder care.
It feels like we've gone through so much information already about elder care,
We have.
but there's always more to learn, right?
There is. It's a really big topic, and things are always changing.
Yeah, so as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
Okay.
Imagine that your loved one could actually tell you exactly what they want for their care. What would they say?
That's such a good question.
What matters most to them? What kind of environment would they be happiest and most comfortable in?
Yeah, it's really important to shift our thinking,
Yeah.
away from what we think is best and really try to understand what they want.
Right, because it might not be what we expect.
Exactly.
They might not want to go to the fanciest place.
Right.
Or have all kinds of renovations done to their home.
Yeah.
Maybe what's most important to them is just being around people they love, or staying in a familiar place,
Yeah.
or having some control over their own life.
Absolutely.
So it's about really trying to see things from their perspective
It is.
and making choices that reflect what they truly want and need.
It's about honoring who they are,
Exactly.
even as they change.
And, at the end of the day, elder care is about so much more than just the practical stuff.
It is.
It's about preserving dignity, respecting their choices,
Yes.
and making sure that they can live a full and meaningful life.
Absolutely.
Well, I think that's a perfect note to end on.
It is.
Thank you so much for joining us
Yeah.
on this deep dive into elder care.
It was my pleasure.
It's a complicated subject.
It is.
But hopefully we've given you some useful information and resources,
I hope so.
and maybe even a little bit of hope and encouragement.
Yeah. And just remember, you're not alone in this.
Right. There are so many people who are going through the same thing,
There are.
and there's help out there if you need it.
Absolutely.
So keep learning,
Yeah.
keep asking questions, and most importantly, keep talking to your loved ones.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll see you next time.